Jamal Greene, professor at Columbia Law School. Professor, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So what is the protocol of all this? Is this kind of unusual, this particular case?
Well, there are a number of unusual factors in this case. I mean, one is the president's under investigation, and there's some chance that whatever happens with that investigation could wind up before the court. And so we don't have a situation in the past where someone under investigation is actually making a selection for the court. So that's certainly unorthodox.
And what if Richard Nixon, at the height of the Watergate scandal and all the congressional investigations, had been forced to nominate a Supreme Court justice? There is some similarities here, right?
Well, there would have been some parallels, but the real difference is Nixon had a Democratic Congress, right? So the politics of it line up very differently here. You have a Republican Congress with a very narrow Republican majority in the Senate, and so whatever we think about the propriety of all this, it really comes down to whether the Republicans in the Senate are going to think it improper or think anything improper about it. And I think so far we don't know enough to know that there's anything super suspicious.
Right. You know you're aware of the backgrounds of the other so-called shortlist candidates. Is Judge Kavanaugh, sort of the safest of the three others that were on that short list?
Well, I think he's safe in one sense, which is that this guy has been on the Supreme Court short list for almost his entire professional life. I mean, so the last dozen years at least, he's been someone who's talked about as a potential Supreme Court nominee, and so he's well credentialed. Everyone, people think he's smart, that sort of thing. But at the same time, he has a longer paper trail in a number of other ways. He has 300 opinions as a Court of Appeals judge. He co-authored the Starr Report back in the 1990s during the Clinton investigation. And he was a staff...
You're talking about the Kenneth Starr
The Kenneth Starr Whitewater investigation back in the 1990s. He was a staff secretary and then worked in the White House counsel's office under George Bush. So there's lots of emails that he sent that could eventually be made public. So there's a lot of paper to go through here that might not have applied to the other candidates. But in terms of his judicial acumen, in terms of his grace under pressure, I expect him to perform very well at the hearing, so he's safe in that sense.
And the odds against the Democrats prevailing here and trying to block this nomination, of course, infinitesimal at this point. But they're going to try to raise some of those issues in those 300 opinions and try to get under it.
Yeah, there'll be a lot to play with here. I mean, the behavior of the Whitewater investigation and the Starr Report that followed it, that's going to be fair game. He has a number of law review articles he's written in which he has said things that can be fodder for some hits during the confirmation hearing. He said some things about whether he thinks a president should be subject to investigation while he's in office. That's certainly going to get a lot of attention. And he's really been someone who, on the bench and also in his own writings, has been in favor of a fairly expansive view of executive power. And with a president who's not especially popular, and certainly not popular among the base of the Democratic senators, they're going to make a lot of hay of that.
How is this going to get, let's say he gets confirmed, it'll now be a clear 5-4 majority for the conservative Republicans. How will the key issues that so many Democrats fear, have been fearing for a long time, would be at risk? Gun control, gay rights, same-sex marriage, abortion rights, women's right to choose. How will those kind of cases make their way to the Supreme Court? Fill us in a little bit.
Well, the Supreme Court has control over its docket, more or less, so it gets to decide which cases to hear. Traditionally, the court takes cases where there's a split in authority among the lower courts. So if one court of appeals decides one way and another decides a different way, then the court is likely to take that kind of case. So the traditional criteria are, is there confusion or disagreement about the law among the lower courts? Now, if you have a court that wants to reach out to decide an issue, it's always a possibility that the court can pick off a case that they just think is wrongly decided below, or they just want to make a statement on.
Are there cases right now that you're aware of, or are there just always going to be cases?
Well, it's always going to be the case. I mean, I think one thing you're likely to see with a more reliably conservative court is those advocates, those right-wing activists who are thinking about bringing certain kinds of issues before the court.
They're looking for them.
Are going to be more aggressive about that than they would have been with justice candidates.
You were a clerk to Supreme Court Justice Stevens, now retired, and doing well, I understand, in his late 90s, still alive and kicking. And what's it like? Take us back behind the chambers when something like this, so public and divisive, a confirmation hearing is taking place. What's it like back there?
Well, I didn't get the pleasure of a confirmation hearing while I was with Justice Stevens, but what is really interesting about the court is it really does feel quite cloistered from the public debate outside of the court. I think part of that might be Justice Stevens himself, who had a very even-tempered temperament, but part of it, I think, is they have life appointments. They kind of play the long game. There'd be any number of instances where the clerks, who are only there for a year, would be bickering about something or fighting about a case, and Justice Stevens would say, don't worry about it. We'll get the next one.
And hence why sometimes some justices make surprise rulings. Because they're taking the long game.
Yeah, they have a very long view of these things, and I was there about a dozen years ago, and maybe things have changed a little bit as the rest of the country has become more polarized. But within the court itself, at least interpersonally, the justices are very cordial with each other. It's a very serene environment.
It's unfair to ask you this. 15 seconds. Justice Kennedy's legacy.
Same-sex marriage and gay rights in general. He basically wrote all the important cases in that area. Strongly First Amendment pro-justice, but also deeply conservative in a number of other ways, including states' rights and reducing the power of the federal government in a number of other ways.
Fascinating topic, fascinating times, and thanks for giving us some insight into it.
Thank you.
Professor Jamal Greene from Columbia Law School.